Dad said real women don't work. Then I became the person who decided whether his. My name is Evelyn Harper. And when I was 28, I pitched a business plan that could have saved my father's company. He laughed and raised a glass to me, saying, "To Evelyn, the pretty one, not the CEO." He trained my brothers, gave them titles, gave them power. Me? He said real women don't work. But 20 years later, I walked into his boardroom, not as his daughter, as the consultant who would decide whether his empire lived or died. And this time he didn't interrupt me. I grew up in a house where legacy was everything. My father, Charles Harper, was a towering figure in our small East Coast town, founder of Harper & Row Logistics, president of the Rotary Club, keynote speaker at every business luncheon, and patriarch of a family that looked perfect from the outside. 3 children, 1 estate, 1 name that he believed needed to be carried forward with strength. That strength, as he defined it, lived in my brothers, not in me. I was the oldest, born first, walked first, read first. But the moment my mother gave birth to twins, 2 healthy boys, it was like the family future got reassigned. Suddenly I was just Evelyn, the helper, the one who took neat notes and made tea during family meetings, the one who got praised for being supportive, the one who was never asked what she wanted. I still remember the night it hit me, the night the mask cracked. I was 28. I just finished my MBA, full scholarship, top of my class. My thesis on sustainable supply chain strategies had been cited in multiple trade journals. I had flown home for my father's 60th birthday gala, hoping to share something important. That night, under chandeliers and live jazz, I found my father near the bar. I was nervous, rehearsing my words in my head. "Dad," I said, gently tapping his shoulder. "I've been thinking, what if Harper & Row expanded its warehouse operations to include eco-certification? There's a shift happening. ESG compliance is becoming more than a trend. I think we could." He waved a hand, barely looking up. "Evelyn," he chuckled, "you've always been so idealistic. That's why I adore you." Then he raised his glass and turned to the men standing beside him. "To my daughter," he said. "The pretty one, not the CEO." The table erupted in laughter. I smiled. What else could I do? My throat burned, but I smiled, because I knew if I walked away they'd call me too sensitive. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and cried. It wasn't the first time he dismissed me, but it was the first time I realized he would never see me as a leader, no matter what I accomplished. To him, I was born to be beautiful, not brilliant, polished, not powerful, presentable, not in charge. Later that evening, I overheard him telling a guest, "Evelyn's into business now. One of those online degrees, I think. But she'll settle down. Real women do eventually." Real women. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter. What did he mean, real women? The ones who gave up their dreams for Sunday dinners and polite applause? The ones who raised other people's children, while pretending their own aspirations didn't exist? Was I not real because I wanted something more? My mother never contradicted him in public. But once, while clearing dishes with me in the kitchen, she whispered, "I wanted to be an architect once. Built cities in my mind. But your father, he thought a blueprint was a waste of time if it wasn't for a nursery." She looked at me and touched my cheek. "You're not like me. You still have time. Just don't wait for them to clap. They never will." I moved out 2 months later. Quietly. Without an announcement. No big speech.
No confrontación.
Just a one-way ticket back to New York and a job offer from a consulting firm that actually read my thesis and wanted to pay me to fix what powerful men break. From then on, I became a ghost at family gatherings. They'd send the occasional text, "Coming for Christmas?" And I'd reply with vague apologies, year-end reviews, tight schedule. In truth, I stopped trying to force myself into a story that never had a seat for me. But that wound, that deep, invisible ache of being your father's it never quite healed. Especially when he gave my brothers junior executive titles, despite neither of them finishing college. Especially when he called me to ask if I could review one of their proposals, but then reminded me not to take credit. Especially when the family newsletter called me Evelyn, our world traveler. As if I was floating. As if I hadn't built a career brick by brick. They thought of me as a drifter. But I wasn't drifting. I was building. Quietly. Relentlessly. By 35, I was consulting for mid-size firms on bankruptcy recovery. By 38, I was brought in as the youngest VP at Greystone Global, a firm known for saving legacy corporations from internal rot. I started to specialize in family businesses. The kind where names mattered more than results. The kind where sons inherited power and daughters inherited silence. And I got good at it. So good that when someone asked, who turned around Helix Freight? The answer was, Evelyn Harper. Not just anyone. Still, I never told my family. Not even my mother. Because I knew deep down they wouldn't ask. They weren't curious about who I was becoming. Until one morning, an email landed in my inbox. Subject: Urgent, confidential request regarding Harper & Row Logistics from Preston & Lowell Legal Associates. I blinked at the screen. My father's company. My family name. The body of the email was direct. Ms. Harper, we have been retained by Harper & Row's independent board to recommend a third-party restructuring advisor. Your name was submitted unanimously for consideration. I reread it 3 times. And for the first time in years, I laughed. Not out of joy, but from something sharper. Something between disbelief and poetic justice. My father, the man who once said real women don't work, was now in trouble. And the only woman qualified to save him was me. Evelyn opens the attached PDF proposal. As her eyes scan the projected losses and illegal internal transfers, her expression hardens. She closes her laptop slowly. So this is how it ends, she whispers. Not with revenge, but with a choice. Evelyn quietly builds a powerhouse career, while remaining erased in her family's eyes. We watch her rise from silence. A hidden empire begins to grow. Most people assume power looks loud: corner offices, shouting matches, red bottom heels stomping down corporate hallways. But my power grew quietly. In rented apartments. In late-night slide decks. In spreadsheets that no one saw but changed the direction of billion-dollar companies. I didn't need them to see me anymore. After the email about Harper & Row's crisis, I didn't reply right away. I let it sit, like an unopened letter from the past. Because before I could decide what to do with my father's empire, I needed to remember how I had built my own. After leaving my family's orbit, I poured everything into work. I started at the bottom, strategy analyst at a mid-sized logistics firm in upstate New York. The office smelled like stale coffee and floor cleaner, and my cubicle had water damage on one side. But it was mine. No one interrupted me to ask if I'd be done soon so someone else could use the computer. No one asked me to proofread their reports, only to sign their name at the bottom. Here, if I wrote something good, it got noticed. If I fixed a problem, it got rewarded. Slowly I climbed. By 32, I was presenting restructuring proposals to boards. By 34, I was flown to London to lead a turnaround for an old money shipping conglomerate. By 36, I was recruited by Greystone Global, the gold standard in corporate rehabilitation. When empires bled money, Greystone was called. And when Greystone needed someone to diagnose the rot behind the revenue reports, they called me. I was their scalpel. I didn't yell. I didn't pose for Forbes covers. I just delivered results that made failing patriarchs hold emergency board votes. My specialty? Family-run businesses collapsing under the weight of ego and nepotism. I understood the psychology. How fathers overestimated their sons, undervalued their daughters, and ignored changing markets. How loyalty replaced logic. How women were asked to help, but never lead. I never told clients my background, but every time a CEO said, "My son's been shadowing me since he was 10. He knows the business," I'd smile and ask, "Does he know how to read a liquidity forecast?" I became the ghost in the room, the woman no one expected, until it was too late to ignore her. And yet, back home I remained invisible. Family group chats still buzzed without me. My brothers sent photos of their vacations, their boats, their work hard, play hard weekends, all subsidized by company money. My name came up only when they needed a favor. "Evelyn, can you look at this presentation for Liam? He's pitching next week." "Evelyn, Mom says you might know someone who could get Trevor into that business seminar?" Not once did they ask how I was doing. Not once did they say, "Tell us what you're working on." I was the family's emergency technician, called when something broke, not invited when something was celebrated. At one point I thought about confronting them, about sending a long message, full of boundaries and hurt. But I didn't, because I realized something. You don't owe explanations to people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, I focused on building something that couldn't be erased. At Greystone, I began mentoring younger women, analysts, interns, receptionists, women who reminded me of myself at 22, polite, brilliant, and unsure of their worth. One day, a junior associate named Priya nervously asked if I could look over her performance report. I said yes. She returned a few days later with tears in her eyes. "No one's ever made me feel seen like that," she said. It meant more than any toast or promotion I'd ever received. So I kept going. I created an internal program called Whisper Ladder for women who rise without noise. Within 2 years, we had elevated 47 women to senior positions across the industry. None of my family knew, but I did, and that was enough. Until the email came. I finally replied to the legal firm's request. Short, professional, detached. "Please send full financials and company bylaws for review." I expected a week's delay. They responded within 2 hours, almost frantic. Attached were 63 files. Income statements, lawsuit threats, whistleblower letters. I read them all. And somewhere between line 22 and 23 of the third balance sheet, my heart stopped. $2.4 million in unaccounted internal transfers, all signed by my father. The names used? Trevor Harper, Liam Harper, my brothers. It was clear. Harper and Rowe was bleeding. And my father had authorized risky, maybe illegal, asset movements to cover losses or bonuses. The whistleblower letter suggested that an upcoming audit could lead to board removal, or worse. Suddenly, I understood why they had chosen me. I wasn't just any consultant. I was the one person who knew the company's bones, and had no emotional reason to protect its old guard. But they were wrong about one thing. I did have emotional reasons, just not the kind they imagined. A week later, I was speaking at a leadership event in Boston. My keynote topic, Legacy versus Liability, when founders become the risk. Afterward, during the Q&A, a man in his 60s stood up and asked, "What if the founder is your father?" There was laughter in the room. I smiled gently. Then you build a future your daughters can believe in, not one they have to heal from. The room went silent, and then it erupted in applause. That night I stood on the hotel balcony with a glass of water, staring at the city skyline. My phone buzzed, a message from the legal team. "Board has approved your engagement. Your assessment will determine next steps." It wasn't poetic revenge. It was responsibility. And for the first time I realized I was the adult in the room now. Not the daughter. Not the afterthought. The decision maker. A few days later I flew back to my hometown, the place I had avoided for nearly a decade. I wore black slacks, a pressed ivory blouse, and carried no luggage. I wouldn't be staying long. As I entered the towering glass building my father had once bragged about designing to look like a fortress, the security guard didn't recognize me. "Are you with catering?" he asked. I paused.
No.
"I'm with oversight." He blinked and buzzed me in. The receptionist offered me coffee. I said no, I knew where everything was. I walked past the same boardroom where I once handed out flyers as a teenager, where my father told me to smile more during his annual company speeches. Now I walked into that boardroom not as a guest, but as a hired authority. The table was surrounded by gray-haired men in suits. A few looked up and did a double take. One leaned over and whispered to another, likely thinking I couldn't hear. "Is that Charles's daughter? Thought she worked in HR." I set my folder on the table. Calm. Centered. "Gentlemen," I said. "Let's begin." As the room fell silent, Evelyn opened her laptop and projected a slide that read, "Assessment Summary, Mismanagement, Nepotism, and Paths to Recovery," by Evelyn Harper, Executive Lead Consultant. The men paled, and Evelyn, for the first time in her life, didn't blink. The silence in the boardroom was almost reverent, not respectful, startled, like they'd seen a ghost walk through the wall. I looked around at the familiar faces. My father's former CFO, his cousin Harold, who'd sat on the board for 20 years without understanding a single operational metric. Two of his golf friends who somehow held voting power over multi-million-dollar decisions. And then at the head of the table sat my father, Charles Harper, the man who once told me women didn't belong at this table. Now, he looked small in the chair he'd once ruled from. His suit didn't fit as sharply. His jaw had softened. His eyes, once dismissive, flickered with something unfamiliar, worry. But he still tried. "Evelyn," he said, clearing his throat, "you didn't tell us you were coming personally. We assumed. You assumed I'd send a male partner." I cut in gently but firmly. "You assumed wrong." A beat of silence. Then I clicked the remote, and my presentation glowed onto the large wall screen. Assessment Overview: Harper & Row Logistics, Crisis, Compliance and Corrective Strategy. I took a breath. Let them feel it. Let them squirm. Let's begin. Over the next hour, I walked them through a summary of my findings. Controlled. Unemotional. Precise. Line by line I exposed their decay. $7.8 million in unresolved payouts, 3 pending lawsuits for employee discrimination, 12 senior hires with no documented vetting or experience, internal fund redirection involving family accounts. Every line item felt like pulling up weeds from my childhood, finally showing what had always been rotting beneath the surface. Halfway through, someone interrupted. "Excuse me, Ms. Harper," one of the elder board members said. "We've always run this business based on trust. Family trust." I looked at him. "And how has that worked out for you?" He went quiet. "I wasn't there to punish them. But I wasn't there to protect them either." I presented my proposal. A 90-day restructuring plan led by Greystone, full oversight, no interference, mandatory separation of governance from bloodline. The real sting? My brothers would be removed from operational roles immediately, pending investigation.
No severance.
They weren't just liabilities, they were active risks. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. This is our family, Evelyn." "No," I said. "This is a corporation. And your shareholders are tired of pretending it's not." The line didn't come from anger. It came from years of invisible labor, of watching women be pushed aside in favor of less competent men simply because they shared a last name. There was a mirrored moment then. I remember being 14, sitting at this same table during Bring Your Child to Work Day. My brothers were praised for asking questions about profits. I had drawn a detailed floor plan for a more efficient shipping warehouse layout, and my father laughed, saying, "That's cute, but maybe save the drawing for home decor, sweetheart." Now I stood in the same room, redrawing the entire future of his company, and nobody was laughing. The meeting ended with agreement not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. As the board filed out, my father remained seated. I started to gather my notes, but he spoke. "I never thought it would come to this." I looked up steady. "Did you think no one would notice?" He shook his head, eyes distant. I didn't think you'd be the one holding the knife." "It's not a knife, Dad. It's a pen. And I'm writing a different ending than the one you gave me." Later that day, I walked through the Harper & Row offices alone. Desks I once passed by bringing coffee. Walls I once decorated for holiday parties when they didn't ask me to join strategy meetings. And there in the corner outside the executive suite, I saw something. A photo frame. It held a picture of my father and my brothers, cutting the ribbon on a new facility. My name wasn't mentioned in the press release, even though the logistics plan they used was mine, quietly submitted months before. No credit. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I walked into the CEO office and placed my own frame on the desk. A photo of my Greystone team, smiling victorious after a major turnaround win. No family.
No legacy.
Just earned pride. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented the transition plan. My brothers raged. Liam sent a 3-page email calling me a power-hungry traitor. Trevor called my phone 17 times in one night, leaving drunken voicemails that ranged from threats to pathetic apologies. I didn't answer either of them. Because here's the thing about being erased for so long: once you finally see your worth, you stop asking for permission to stand in your power. The staff was confused at first, then grateful. Departments got reorganized not based on surname but skill. Women were promoted. HR violations were addressed. And slowly, the company began breathing again. The old guard resisted, of course. One executive muttered in a meeting, "We need to be careful not to let emotions run this place." I turned to him and replied, "Emotion didn't cause this collapse. Arrogance did. I'm here to clean up your mess." He didn't speak again. On the 21st day of restructuring, a junior employee, a single mom named Carla, came up to me quietly in the break room. "I heard what you said in the boardroom," she whispered. "I watched you say it. I didn't know women could talk like that. Be like that." I smiled. "We always could. They just made sure we didn't get the mic." She looked down at her coffee. "I want to learn. I want to become someone like you. Then come to my office at lunch," I said. "Let's start now." That night, Evelyn receives a formal notice. Her father has requested a private meeting, off the record, at the estate. Alone. She stares at the message.
No advisors. No lawyers.
Just you and me. Charles Harper. She closes her laptop. The room goes quiet. "Let's see if the king is ready to kneel," she whispers. The Harper estate hadn't changed. Same manicured hedges. Same wrought iron gate. Same stone lions out front, guarding the house like ancient symbols of a name that never protected me. I parked near the edge of the circular driveway, far enough from the fountain where my father always insisted guests should park. I wasn't a guest. And I wasn't a daughter arriving for dinner. I was walking into the final scene of a script he never let me write. The butler opened the door as if expecting me. Miss Evelyn, he said gently. He's in the study. The study. The room where my father kept all his awards, his framed newspaper interviews, and the infamous red leather chair he called his throne of ideas. I used to sit on the floor of that study as a child, sketching on napkins, while he took calls and puffed cigars. I was never invited to sit at the desk, only near it. Until now. He didn't stand when I entered. He didn't smile. Charles Harper looked tired, not just old, but hollowed out in the way men do when they realize their power was built on illusion. You came, he said. You asked. He motioned toward the chair opposite his. He said. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was dense, the kind that forms after years of words unsaid. He leaned back. I built this from nothing, Evelyn. From dirt. From borrowed money and sweat. I gave your brother something I never had. A head start. I said nothing. He wasn't finished. I thought protecting you meant keeping you away from this world. From the stress. The criticism. The wolves. I raised an eyebrow. And calling me the pretty one was what, a charm offensive? He winced. That was a joke. No. That was a message. One you repeated for 30 years. He looked down. For the first time I saw something raw behind his eyes, not regret but exposure. I continued. You taught me I didn't belong here. That leadership was for men. That legacy was a ladder I was allowed to hold, but never climb. He didn't interrupt. You said real women didn't work. But you meant women shouldn't threaten you. That our ideas were decorations. Our ambition was disobedience. Still he stayed silent. And now? The company you built on that belief system is dying. And the only person left to save it is the daughter you never prepared. He finally spoke. I didn't know you'd grow teeth. I shook my head. You didn't want me to. You built me to be quiet. But the world built me better. I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it between us. This is the final proposal. A transfer of voting rights. You'll remain honorary chair. But all decisions will go through the new board structure, which I'll chair. He stared at it. You want me to step aside. I want you to not destroy what your ego built. He glanced up sharply. You still resent me. I don't, I said softly. Because resentment is a weight. And I refuse to carry it into the future I'm building. I slid a pen across the table. He didn't touch it. You know what this feels like, he muttered. It feels like exile. It's not exile, Dad. It's succession. The kind you refuse to plan for. You think you're better than your brothers? I leaned forward.
No.
I know I was the only one watching, learning, preparing. Not because you asked me to, but because I wanted to prove something to myself. He finally picked up the pen, stared at it. Then slowly, with a hand that trembled just slightly, he signed.
Signature.
Charles T. Harper. Bold. Slower than it used to be. Still legible. But not defining anymore. When he was done, he slid the papers back toward me. You win. I looked at him for a long time. There's no winning here, I said. There's only rebuilding. And I intend to do it better than you ever let yourself imagine. I stood folder in hand. But before I turned, he said something I'll never forget. If I had a second life, I'd build it with you in charge from the start. I paused at the doorway. You had one life, Dad. And I'm the one who lived around it. Then I left. That night I returned to my apartment in the city. Small, modern, sunlit. Nothing fancy. But mine. I poured a glass of wine. Opened my laptop. Logged into the Harper and Row board server. And uploaded the signed document. With one click, my father's signature was no longer the final say. Mine was. The next morning, I walked into the office early. The building felt different now, like the air was no longer borrowed. As I reached the CEO office, which had been prepared for me in full, I stopped by the old family photo hanging in the hall. My brothers. My father. Smiling. I removed it. In its place, I hung a framed copy of the original expansion proposal I'd written at 28, the one my father mocked, the one the company now needed to survive. Underneath it, a small plaque. Vision doesn't always speak loud. Sometimes it waits for a seat. That afternoon, I held my first press conference. The media buzzed about the transition. Some headlines read, "Daughter steps in as Harper Empire cracks, Evelyn Harper. From invisible to in charge, the quiet architect of the comeback." I wore a navy suit.
No flashy jewelry. No rehearsed smile.
Just the truth. I stood at the podium and said, I was once told that real women didn't belong in leadership. That legacy was inherited, not earned. I'm here to challenge both those ideas and prove that dignity, intelligence, and vision aren't gendered. They're choices we make. And I'm choosing to lead. As Evelyn exits the conference hall, a young female journalist pulls her aside. Miss Harper, can I ask one last question? Of course. What would you say to daughters who were never chosen? Evelyn pauses, then softly says, choose yourself. Then build something no one can take away. This is the emotional climax. Evelyn returns to the center of the empire, but this time with full control. Her father, once her biggest doubter, now becomes the one who depends on her. The reversal is quiet, powerful, and deeply earned. A week after the transition, the office settled into a strange silence. Not tense, just adjusting. The men who once ran the company through backroom conversations were now required to submit weekly progress updates to a board they no longer controlled. My brothers were officially on leave, and their names had been scrubbed from internal operations. And the staff? They were watching, waiting to see if I'd lead with revenge or with vision. I chose neither. I led with standards. At 9 a.m. sharp, I entered the newly designated executive strategy room, not the one my father had used like a throne room, but a more modern, open space I had designed for transparency and collaboration. 2 women, analysts from different departments, sat at the table, shocked to be invited. I greeted them by name, asked them questions. Listen. The reaction was subtle, but I saw it in their posture. They sat up straighter. In my father's reign, decisions had been top-down, unquestioned. In mine, we rebuilt from the middle, from the people who actually understood the work. Still, not everyone embraced the shift. I heard whispers. She's emotional. Too soft. Where's the edge? It was the usual defense of men who'd built their confidence on exclusion. I ignored them, because I knew the truth. When you're used to privilege, fairness feels like punishment. 3 days later, I got a call from my father's nurse. He's not well, she said gently. He's asking for you. I hesitated. I hadn't been back to the estate since he signed the documents. Part of me thought I never would. But something in her voice softened me. That evening I drove out again. This time I didn't wear power.
No heels. No suit.
Just a wool coat, flats, and a quiet heart. I found him in the sunroom, the one my mother used to read in before she passed. He was seated in an armchair, a blanket over his knees, eyes out the window. The company survived the audit, he said without turning. Yes, I replied, because I cleaned it. A pause. They listened to you. Because I know what I'm talking about. Another pause. Then he looked at me, really looked. I underestimated you. I waited. That wasn't a full apology, but it was something. You ignored me, I said quietly. That's different. He exhaled, The kind of breath men take when they're finally facing themselves. You scared me, he admitted. You were relentless. Precise. And I didn't know how to parent a woman like that. I only knew how to train sons. You didn't train them, I corrected. You handed them a crown and assumed they'd know how to rule. And you? He asked. I found my own tools. And I built my own crown. He looked down at his hands, weathered, twitching slightly. There's a deal I started before you stepped in, he said. An overseas partnership. It's flawed. Risky. But if we can salvage parts of it. I raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me to fix something again? I'm asking you, he said slowly, to teach me how to do this your way. My throat tightened. Not with triumph, with disbelief. With decades of longing crashing into one moment. I sat beside him, not as his daughter, but as his last best chance at doing something right. Then listen. And don't interrupt. He nodded. And we began. Over the next 2 weeks I worked with him quietly. Behind closed doors we dismantled the broken deal. I showed him how modern markets moved, how data spoke louder than instinct. And for the first time in my life he didn't argue. He wrote notes. He asked questions. At one point he said, I never thought I'd say this, but your mind terrifies me. In the best way. I almost laughed. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Then I should have said it sooner. One afternoon we sat reviewing legal clauses and he suddenly asked, Did I ruin it? Between us. I looked at him. Really looked. This man, once infallible, once worshipped, now hollowed, asking for something money couldn't buy. Forgiveness. You didn't ruin it, I said. You just taught me how to live without needing your approval. And now that I've learned that, we can try again. He blinked. You still want that? I don't need it, I said. But I'm open to something new. Something honest. And in that sunroom, where my mother once turned pages of novels she never got to live, a different kind of legacy began. The final board meeting of the quarter arrived. For the first time, Charles Harper entered as a guest. No title. No voting power. And when I introduced the restructured leadership team, diverse, talented, effective, the board applauded. When I presented record turnaround projections, there was real earned silence. And when I finished, everyone stood, including my father. He approached me after the meeting, placed a hand on my shoulder and said, You were never just the daughter. You were the future. I just wasn't brave enough to see it. I know, I said. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. Titled, To Evelyn, the one who taught me how to lead. I didn't read it until I got home. But when I did, I wept. Not because I needed it, but because I had become someone who didn't and still received it. That night, Evelyn walks into the office early, turns on the lights and sees a card on her desk. From the staff. It reads, To our real leader. Thank you for saving what matters. She places the card next to a framed quote. Build quietly. Let the legacy speak. And with that, she sits down to begin her next move. Not as her father's daughter, but as Evelyn Harper. Visionary. Builder. Survivor. The mirrored moment Evelyn has earned for decades. She enters the space that once erased her, and this time, the room rises. She reclaims her dignity, power, and place at the center. Quietly. Unshakably. The invitation was printed on thick ivory cardstock, embossed with gold foil. Harper & Row Legacy Gala. Celebrating 50 years of innovation and family, it was the same gala my father had hosted every decade since the company's inception. Once I had passed out name tags at that event. Another year, I was asked to adjust the floral arrangements because the real guests, my brothers, were late. This time the invitation had my name at the top. Evelyn Harper, host, CEO Legacy Steward. I arrived early. The ballroom shimmered with string lights and candlelit tables. The place smelled of wealth and nostalgia, champagne and polished wood. I stood at the center of the room, letting the silence settle before the noise came. I ran my fingers along the edges of a table that once held place cards for Charles Harper Jr. and Liam Harper VP. Tonight those names were missing. Not out of spite, just accuracy. Guests began arriving in clusters: investors, clients, old board members. Some greeted me with warm smiles, others with polite surprise, but none looked past me anymore. There was no question who was in charge. When I stepped on stage to give the welcome address, I looked out over the crowd and saw them all. My old high school teacher who once told me I was too intense, an ex-boyfriend who said I'd never balance ambition and love, cousins who joked I'd become a spinster in suits, and at a corner table, sitting quietly with a glass of wine, was my father.
No entourage. No interruption.
Just presence. I adjusted the mic. Good evening. When I was 14, I stood at the back of this room handing out name tags. At 28, I pitched a business proposal in this very building that was laughed out of the room. 43. I signed a document that changed everything. I paused. This company has always talked about legacy, but legacy isn't about blood. It's about impact. It's about who shows up when things fall apart, who rebuilds, who leads with clarity, not ego. I looked toward my father. Tonight I thank the men who built the foundation, but I honor the women, the invisible hands who held it up. A few heads turned. A few tears blinked back. To every woman in this room who was told to stay quiet, stay soft, stay behind, I see you. And more importantly, I invite you forward. I stepped back from the mic. The room rose. All of it. They stood for me. After the applause, people began to approach, not to flatter but to share. A female accountant whispered, "I kept my ideas to myself for 10 years. Tomorrow I'm speaking up." A young intern told me, "My mother watched your press clip. She cried. Said she wished she'd seen women like you when she was 20. And then a quiet voice behind me said, "You were always meant for this." I turned. My father. He didn't try to take the mic. He didn't try to reclaim the room. He simply handed me a small box. Inside, the first Harper & Row nameplate from the company's original office. His own etched in brass. It's time the right Harper carried the name. I nodded. And this time we'll build it with everyone at the table. Later that night I sat alone at a table near the window, overlooking the city skyline. I remembered the first time I saw this view, through a window in my father's old office when I was 8. He told me then, "One day your brothers will run this town." He was wrong. I did. The next morning I arrived at work just before sunrise. The city still half asleep, golden with the soft promise of morning. In my office a bouquet waited on the desk. No card. But I knew. The flowers were the kind my mother used to grow. Beside them a note, written in neat, careful handwriting. "You were never just the daughter. You were always the blueprint." Dad. I closed my eyes and let the moment bloom. Not with pride, but with peace. Not because he finally saw me, but because I no longer needed him to. Across the hall I heard laughter. 2 junior staff members, both women, were discussing a new project they were leading. One mentioned her idea being approved without delay. I smiled. The culture had shifted. Not just the names on the walls but the air in the rooms. It was breathable now. Mirrored scene. Years ago I stood outside my father's boardroom, holding coffee and listening through closed doors. Now I sat at the head of that same table calling roll. And when I spoke, everyone listened. At the end of the quarter, the company's stock rebounded. Investors cited leadership, transparency, and strategic innovation as key reasons. Articles were written. But more than that, emails came. From women across the country. You gave me hope. You made me feel like I wasn't crazy. I quit the job where they kept calling me a glorified assistant. Evelyn receives an email marked urgent. From a new startup incubator. Subject: We'd like you to join our board, to mentor the next generation of female founders. She stares at the screen, then clicks, accept. This is where the story resolves not through vengeance, but through transformation, peace, and legacy. Evelyn becomes more than a CEO. She becomes a mirror of what many women have longed to become. They say legacy is what you leave behind. But I've learned legacy is also what you repair, especially when no one thought you could. A month after the gala, the office walls no longer echoed with tension. The culture had shifted. Slowly. Honestly. People no longer waited for orders from the top, they brought forward solutions. They contributed. They felt seen. And quietly women were rising. HR reported more women self-nominating for leadership training. Male executives were requesting unconscious bias workshops. Junior staff began referring to the company as a place where merit speaks louder than names. It wasn't perfect, but it was becoming something new. Something I never thought I'd get to witness in the company that once erased me. One afternoon, I sat on the 42nd floor balcony of our downtown office building, the very tower my father designed, the same one where I was once asked to proofread press releases but never featured in them. This time I was on the cover. A copy of Business Legacy magazine sat on my lap. The headline read, Evelyn Harper, Rebuilding the Empire Her Father Nearly Lost. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Because this story was never about revenge. It was about restoration. That weekend I drove to the cemetery alone. I hadn't been since my mother's funeral 5 years earlier. I brought 2 things, a white rose and a folded letter. The headstone was simple. Marion Harper 1955 to 2018. She loved quietly. I knelt and placed the rose at its base. You were right, Mom. They never clapped. I unfolded the letter. But I didn't need them to. I clapped for myself. And then they listened. I placed the letter beneath the flower, anchored by a stone. Then I sat there for a while, just watching the wind move the grass. I lead now, I whispered. And I've built a seat at the table for every girl who was told to wait their turn. Back at work, I began spending more time mentoring. Not because I had to, but because it grounded me. One of the younger associates, Harper Lynn, yes, her real name, once said during our one-on-one, you make it feel possible. Like dignity doesn't have to be loud to be real. I looked at her. That's because it doesn't. Real power doesn't roar. It endures. It outlasts doubt. And it writes its own ending. She smiled. I want to write mine. Then pick up the pen. As the quarter closed, we announced a new initiative, the Marion Fund, a leadership development program named after my mother, designed to support single mothers, women returning to the workforce, and those rebuilding their careers after domestic or financial abuse. The board approved it unanimously. Some cried. So did I. Because I knew this was the moment women would talk about in rooms I'd never enter. The moment where someone who was once invisible decided not just to be seen, but to create vision for others. Final mirrored scene. At the next family reunion, hosted ironically by one of my brothers, someone clinked a glass and asked for everyone to share a moment they were proud of. In years past, I would have deflected. Stayed quiet. Let the spotlight move past me. This time I stood. I'm proud, I said, that I once sat at a table where I was mocked, and now I build tables where no one is. A few family members looked away, but others clapped. And when the spotlight passed me, I felt whole. In the elevator back at the office one Monday morning, A young intern nervously turned to me. Ms. Harper? Is it okay if I ask a personal question? I nodded. Did it hurt? Being left out all those years? I looked at her for a moment. It did. Until I realized being overlooked gave me something they never had. What's that? Perspective. Humility. And the hunger to build something I didn't need their permission to lead. She looked down. I think I needed to hear that. Then take it, I said. And pass it on. Late at night, the building was nearly empty. She walks the halls, past the executive floor, past the portraits of old leaders, and stops in front of the new wall. Women of Impact at Harper & Row. Her name is there. So are the names of every woman she promoted, mentored, and believed in. She doesn't touch it. Don't cry. She simply stands in the quiet, in the legacy, in the power she built without applause. Then, without a word, she turns off the lights and heads home.